for doing another What I Love About Comics video. So tell us another thing that you love about comics.
Okay, well, I'm going to build off of something that Eric said in his a couple of times ago. Eric was talking about Vertigo and how good it was in the 90s. And I'm not taking anything away from Vertigo because it was excellent. Still is, although they don't do as much stuff. But what I want to talk about is what brought Vertigo about. The darkening of DC and the birth of Vertigo, because it was just fantastic. A lot of people look at the darkening of comics and making them more adult as starting with Frank Miller's Dark Knight and the prestige books that DC started doing. And that's a good place to start it, really. I mean, you had that, you had Mike Grell doing Green Arrow, The Longbow Hunters, Tim Truman doing Hawk World, Howard Chaykin doing The Shadow, and those were all great books. And at the same time they came out, you had this influx of British creators. Of course, the biggest of them was Alan Moore doing Watchmen. But before that, Alan Moore started at DC doing something a little different. He took a character that they had, Swamp Thing, who was originally a horror character, and then they had merged him into the DC universe as a hero. And Alan Moore brought him back to his roots. Turned Swamp Thing into true horror. Swamp Thing learned that he wasn't a person, and that he never had been. He was a plant who had the memories of a person. He introduced the elementals and the Parliament of Trees, a whole mythology. He had Swamp Thing fighting vampires and werewolves, and he moved Swamp Thing away from the DC universe a little bit. Along the way, he also introduced a wisecracking British magician based on Sting, a guy by the name of John Constantine, the Hellblazer. And that's really where Moore started taking horror and fantasy and merging them in with the roots of superheroes. That's one of the tent posts that became Vertigo. The same time that Alan Moore's doing this, you've got this other British guy, Grant Morrison, and he's taking things like Doom Patrol, which was a standard superhero book. It was a little unusual, but a standard superhero book, and turning it on its head, where they started running into creatures like the Scissormen and the Brotherhood of Dada, and as heroes, they were more people that were just dealing with really bizarre situations. And he revolutionized what you could do with superheroes in comics. Grant Morrison is our other big tentpole. Now, Grant Morrison also did other stuff, like Kid Eternity, which again started out in that nice prestige format, 3 issues, where we take a unusual superhero, very secondary character, this kid that died before his time. So he's come back to Earth in a physical body, and he can call forth the spirits of any character or any person that had ever died and bring them forward and have them manifest in real life. And most of the time, he was bringing mythological or fictional characters to life. I need a detective. I'll bring Sherlock Holmes. I need a strong man. I'll get Hercules or Samson. And Grant Morrison took this idea and ran with it, adding a realistic, kind of creepy vibe. What happens when you bring your loved one back? Or someone else's loved one? And how do they react to being brought back from the dead, but only for a very short time period? And so DC had several books that were a little bit more adult. And then they got this other British writer, a guy named Neil Gaiman. And he had an idea for them involving Sandman. And they thought that would be nice. But before that, they wanted him to do something else. And they wanted one of those prestige format books. And the idea was brought forward, how about Black Orchid. Because, well, she's a really bizarre character. She had first shown up in Adventure Comics. She was a D-list hero at best. Her big stick was she could fly, she was super strong, she was invulnerable, and she didn't talk. You never had an origin for the character. You never knew who she really was other than this mysterious person that showed up and fought crime without saying anything. And so let's bring her into modern day. Now, there is a nice story about Neil Gaiman and his pitch for Black Orchid, because you have to remember, he's British. He doesn't speak the way Americans do. He speaks the way English people do. And here they're talking about Black Orchid. And he's like, yeah, I can do something with Black Orchid. Give me a couple of days. I can do something with Black Orchid. But he was hearing it as Black Hawk Kid, not Black Orchid. So here he is meeting with Karen Berger, the head of Vertigo, doing a pitch. Yeah, I can do something with this character. And he walks away and says, Black Hawk Kid. Do they mean like that little Chinese guy that ran around with the Blackhawks? Chop Chop? Why do they want to do something with such a racist caricature? And then he had some people tell him, oh, wait a second, no, Black Orchid, that's this character. And he had to come up with something. So what did he do? Well, Swamp Thing is popular. That's a plant elemental. Took the mythology from, or the stories that Moore had done with that, added in the Parliament of the Trees, and then took the Earl Kings from folklore and some stuff from other mythologies and merged it all together and did a 3-issue miniseries where he introduced Black Orchid as not a plant elemental, but a plant intelligence that mimicked humans. She was never really human. She took on the persona of a dead person. And as a plant, oh yeah, well, she seems invulnerable. Bullets aren't going to hurt her. They don't bounce off. They sink in. Shoot a tree once or twice. It's not going to die. Super strong. Well, extra fiber. And the other reason that she didn't talk, she couldn't talk. And as a plant, if this body gets destroyed, this part of it gets destroyed, it might be able to regrow. And that was Black Orchid. And then Neil went on to do Sandman, the master of dreams, mixing mythology, DC history, real life, fiction, everything into one melting pot and coming up with stories that didn't feel like a DC book or a Marvel book or a superhero book or anything that had been done before. It felt like something new, exciting, different. It was really adult fantasy. At the same time, Alan Moore's still working away on Swamp Thing. The Comics Code Authority wasn't even showing on Swamp Thing. It was listed as sophisticated horror. And so all of a sudden DC has this whole line of books that don't quite fit with anything they're currently doing. And so what do? Well, they had a couple of others, in particular Animal Man, which I had mentioned a little bit as Grant Morrison, doing, here's a superhero, again, D-lister at best. But let's look at it. If you can be take the power of any animal, what's that going to do to you? Buddy Baker, a nobody in the superhero universe who all of a sudden becomes an animal rights activist, a vegetarian because you don't eat things that you know that intimately, and again, a surreal feeling where anything can happen. He meets the coyote from the Roadrunner cartoons. He meets the author of his books. again, we're not talking the normal superheroes, but more stuff that was designed for a more mature audience that grew up with characters they loved but wanted to go on. There was also another book by another British guy, not as much a tentpole, a guy named Pete Milligan. He had taken a 70s character, Shade the Changing Man, 7 issues of a book by Steve Ditko about an alien from another dimension, Meta, who would come to Earth with a special vest that he called a madness vest, or the M vest, fighting crime from his dimension on Earth. And Pete Milligan turned around and said, well, let's take that concept and change it. And so when Rock Shade comes from this other dimension to Earth, his consciousness comes, but his body doesn't, and goes into the body of a killer who was just executed. He has the madness powers, and then goes about trying to discover America. And it's a British take on what is America like to outsiders. He dealt with concepts like the American Scream, which in his mind was what happened with John F. Kennedy and how that affected the entire United States. And again, this is not superhero. What do we do with this? So eventually, all of these books, which most of them were edited by Karen Berger, DC decided they needed to stand apart. So they took those books and put them together and called them Vertigo. So what was Vertigo? It's D-list characters, superheroes and others, with a modern take, with horror and fantasy merged in, and that's what Vertigo became. And I mentioned Black Orchid, I mentioned Kid Eternity. They came back as ongoing series, not by the original people that Vertigoized them, but they did come back. And then you had other books that added in some of the stuff that Eric didn't mention. Grant Morrison's Invisibles, which was not his take on superheroes as much as his take on American comics versus British comics versus Indian comics. 3 different volumes, each one with a different flavor and tone. You had stuff like when Sandman ended, you had The Dreaming. Other people taking the characters that were the backup characters in Sandman and giving them their own stories. You had things like Books of Magic, which, again, created by Neil Gaiman as a 4-issue prestige series. Here is the child who will become the world's greatest magician, being introduced to magic by 4 different people. Each issue was fully painted by a different writer, or by a different painter, all written by Neil Gaiman. Wonderful series that was designed to introduce what was the DC mythology and magic like. So you have Tim Hunter, a British orphan who has an owl for a familiar and is living with his aunt and uncle and his fat bullying cousin, being told he's the world's greatest magician. And he is going to change the face of magic. And he goes on a journey to learn what magic is like, being carted around by characters like John Constantine and Mr. E and the Phantom Stranger. Constantine called them the Trenchcoat Brigade. And you had all of this great stuff that moved on and became modern comics for adults. Oh, and just so that you know, since you might have, when I was describing Books of Magic, it might have sounded at least a little bit like Harry Potter. it was around just a couple of years before J.K. Rowling started her stuff, like about 5. Don't worry, although there's a lot of similarities, thematically they're very different, very cool stories, and I can't recommend them highly enough, and that's one of the things I love about comics.